morning, guys. Here we are. One class before Bad Friday. On Friday, I'm going to say those of you who've gone Good Friday before Easter and all, so welcome to Bad Friday. Bad Friday at Black Week, or something like that. A movie or something like that. Anyway, we are on the threshold of a wonderful saga that I have to tell you that I'm really going to begin only next time, but this is the setup for it, which is the story over 3 or 4 lectures of my work with the first case of so-called multiple personalities that I encountered that took place back in the 1970s, and it's a wonderful journey that I take you into the inside of it in enormous detail. It's the best way to tell you about that human situation that we call multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder. These words, these terms are ridiculous, but there they are. But today's kind of a preliminary for that, holding forth further about trauma, its effects, the coping strategies that we use to survive trauma, and the conditions under which those coping strategies lead to the multiplication of personalities. And then I want to tell you some examples of the kinds of traumas that generate this situation. Today's going to be a rough lecture for you guys, I'm warning you now. I tell stories of atrocities committed against children today. And you have to go there, though, because if you soft pedal it, you don't understand what the extreme nature of the circumstances we're dealing with in this area of our study. Also today I give you one of Atwood's famous charts. Very famous in my mind only, and then to you guys because it might be on the test, so watch out. But it's my way of summarizing the very sharp differences between what is called schizophrenia, not worrying about the diagnostic term, but thinking about the people to whom that label gets applied and their phenomenology, and dissociative identity disorder, again, not worrying about the label, but about the people and their situations that get labeled by that. And they are 2 very distinct things. However, language is weird, and different words are used differently in different contexts. And in the media, the word schizophrenia more or less is interchangeable with dual personality. But in psychiatry and psychology, they're 2 very different things. Dual personality is a special case of multiple personality. Dual means there's just 2. But there can be 2 or more. In fact, it can range from 2 to 400. The greatest number that I've ever heard of was 400. Maybe somebody has even more than that in the way of personalities. One could study that kind of thing. It's very interesting. So, like if you just read Newsweek or something, schizophrenia, dual personality, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But in psychiatry and psychology, they're very distinct situations. And when we diagnostically, but also if you translate the phenomenology from the diagnosis, they're very distinct experiential circumstances that people find themselves in. So my chart highlights the differences. And although I'm drawing very sharp distinctions, and I think of these things as very distinct from each other, it always turns out that when you have very sharp distinctions, there is still a gray area where you can't quite make up your mind, and there are human circumstances that fit a little bit both of them. So it's cut and dry the way I'm laying it out there, but reality is more messy than that. But still in all, there's a reason, there's good reason for making these distinctions. So let me just rattle on about all that. Before I even get there, though, what do I have written up there? The general category that this is about is the formation of a multiplicity of alters. The word alter is short for alternate or alternate personality. So when we refer to a person showing alters, that means there are different identities that come and go and are distinct from each other, most often having amnesia with respect to each other. Not always, but most often that's the case. When one alter is present or in the ascendant, the others are somehow latent, not there, and they don't remember what the one that is in the ascendant is, the experiences that one is undergoing. And then that one disappears, and the others have amnesia for the period that just occurred. So this is real general, and if you don't follow everything I'm going to say, or you're getting a little mixed up, don't worry. We return and return to every point and repeat it in different words. So extreme repeated dissociations of trauma sometimes eventuate in a multiplicity of alters. Don't forget what I mean by trauma. I do not mean painful, even horribly painful events that take place. I mean something off the scale, outside our ability even to put into language. It is so impossible to assimilate or come to terms with. So trauma is not something dealt with. It's too much to deal with. So it always, inevitably, becomes dissociated. That's the only way you can cope with it, is try to separate from it, turn yourself into someone it didn't happen to. So trauma and dissociation, the way I think of it, are two sides of the same coin. They go together. That is, again, using the word trauma in a different way than we normally we just mean by trauma something really bad, like really horribly painful. I was so traumatized when my girlfriend left me. I'm not using it that way. When your girlfriend leaves you, and even if you feel like throwing yourself off the bridge, and even do jump off the bridge maybe, and then somehow survive, come to the water and say, well, maybe I'll live on a little longer. But you remember the horror, the pain, the loss, the grief, the sorrow, the rejection feeling, the worthlessness that she makes you feel by leaving you. That's not really trauma. That's horror. That's horrifyingly painful events. But they're part of your memory. You can remember that it occurred. You can think about it, maybe not without crying. But trauma, you go numb because it's too much. And if you don't go, the numbing of dissociation is a way of surviving, because if you don't, evidently, I think you would just break down. You maybe become psychotic, or maybe just have to die. Maybe just have to choose death, commit suicide or something. So I'm kind of rattling on, and I'm going to hit different aspects as I go. But dissociation is actually a friend. It saves children from the most terrible things that happen to them that otherwise would kill them. Either directly, by just being so stressful their bodies couldn't stand it, or by inducing a suicide or some other form of self-destruction that would end in death. But dissociation allows you to have something happen that is really unsurvivable in its full onslaught. But yet you can survive, but you have to turn yourself into someone it didn't happen to. You go numb with respect to what did happen. Perhaps you remember cognitively the event, as I was saying last time, that something happened. Maybe you have the images and you have a few words to say, yes, I was raped. But there's no feeling about it at all. So the emotional reality of you turn yourself into someone unaffected emotionally by what happened. I know all about this. I've said this to you before. I hope I'm not just endlessly, uselessly repeating this. But I am a practitioner of the art of dissociation, and I survived as a person largely because of it, because I had a terrible trauma when I was 8 years old and my mother suddenly died, and she was very, very close to me and other family members and was the emotional center of our family life. I did not go into amnesia about it. I knew it had happened, but I walled off all feeling about it. So the emotional disaster was dissociated, and I was tremendously upset for maybe a month, and then went numb. I just went about my business with my friends and my schoolwork and continued and functioned at a real high level. I was kind of a weird kid because I was so busy not feeling these feelings. But I was able to function very calm. And I remember when I was 10 years old and 14 years old and 16 years old, I was aware that my mother had dropped dead. Somebody asked me, where's your mother? I said, well, she died when I was 8. But that was a piece of factual information in an encyclopedia entry, so to speak. It was a biographical detail, but had no effect on me. What effect did it have on you, George? None. Just something that happened. You know, things happen. You're going along, something happens, and you go on along some more, and something else happens. That's all there is to it. Of course, the fact that one doesn't feel an effect is the manifestation of dissociation itself, and it means that something that could completely disrupt and destroy a childhood can be set aside, and so a child can go back to school. And some of you this is a big enough class, some of you guys lost your parents, same as me, it happens, or siblings or something like that. Then you're given kind of the freedom to function. You can function at a high level. And sometimes trauma raises the level of the functioning of the survivor. That's really an interesting thing about it. Sometimes very severe shocks that happen to a child, paradoxically, don't contribute to a breakdown. They're dissociated, but it leads to a kind of proliferating of latent talents that might have been there anyway. I might be an example of that. I know that I'm intellectually, academically, as a student, in the aftermath of my mother's death, I'm just telling you this, and I don't know what you'll make of it, but my performance skyrocketed after that, and I've wondered about that. Suddenly I was reading at a high school level in the 4th grade and 5th grade, and I wondered sometimes if the trauma did something to my mind and caused it to accelerate in certain other areas as it was busy at the same time fending off the devastating emotions that were involved. There are case studies that have been done of people who became geniuses at age 4 or 5 in the aftermath, in the wake of very severe trauma. There's a term for that in psychoanalysis that I talk about a little bit in the personality course, not in this one, but I'll mention it now. It fits into this lecture. You've never heard of this, most of you. Traumatic progression is the name of it, the term. And it's contrasted with what is called traumatic regression. Regression means you go back to a previous level of function. You go backwards in time. So sometimes a traumatic shock happens to a child, and its effect is to have the child lose capacities that have evolved up to that point and go back to an earlier level of functioning in his or her life. Like a real simple example would be a 5-year-old who has long since learned not to wet his bed. Suddenly, daddy comes in and rapes him. I'll just say that, which is one of the things that can happen. And then this happens a few times, and suddenly this kid is peeing in his bedclothes all the time. That's a traumatic regression. An earlier level of functioning is resumed when a further advance had taken place. But sometimes trauma, even including a sexual attack, could be it, or a traumatic loss, like in my case, has a strange set of consequences, where suddenly the child seems to almost leap over childhood and become precociously adult, or intellectually hyper-mature, and be capable of abstract thinking, almost like jumping over Piaget in stages and reaching formal operations at age 5, or something, if you want to look at it in those terms. It's like a miracle. It's amazing. It does happen. It doesn't happen reliably, regularly, but one observes this sort of thing. Trauma is so incredible, and so sometimes great creativity in the world is associated with terrible childhood trauma. Trauma is a mixed bag. It doesn't just destroy. It sometimes promotes a hyper-development of talents and capacities that we're not going to be there otherwise. Okay, so there's that. Anyway, I think of dissociation as a friend, but it's also an enemy. You want to know? I can also tell you why it's an enemy. It's the same reason why I've had to have 25 or 30 years of therapy and still need another 30, according to my wife, as I've told you. Because you numb out on what happened. You survive, hey, go forward, normal, get hyper good grades and everything. But then you're called upon as an adult to be a functioning human being, which includes relating to other people and caring about them and loving them and letting yourself be vulnerable to them. But if you've walled off a massive pain from dissociation, you're not emotionally all there. So you get in trouble later in life because of the dissociation that you have done. And that dissociation needs to be undone. And you need to be flooded by the pain that formerly was safely kind of set aside so that life could continue. So dissociation is both your best friend who helps you live. I have great respect for it. It saves lives, literally. But it's also your worst enemy because it destroys your friendships, your marriages, your love affairs. It can disrupt your whole life because you're not emotionally whole and intact. And we need to be whole and intact as much as possible. One of the purposes of therapy would be to open up the walled-off pain and let it flood you. And let it be spoken of for the first time, perhaps, and put into images and be dreamed about, talked about, processed, worked through. It's never fun. It's always agony to do that because of the nature of the process. But it's a healing thing that makes a person more whole. And this is all talked about quite a bit in Abyss of Madness, in the chapter on which I call the unbearable and the unsayable. Trauma is unbearable and unsayable. For me, it's by definition. A trauma is an event that you can't bear, so it's not born. And it's unsayable. You can't put words on it, so no words are said. That's the wall of silence that always descends when there is serious trauma of any kind. Some traumas that we have include demands from the perpetrators of the trauma against us, like the sexual attackers. If you say anything about this kid, I'm going to kill you and your whole family. How many times have I heard this? Lots of times. And so that enforces a wall of silence. But the threats against the child are not, in my opinion, are not the primary reason for the wall of silence. It's the trauma itself bursts the boundary of what can be said. And so the most natural thing is just to go mute. You don't talk about it. You can't talk about it. But then maybe if you're like George Atwood, you get later in life and get in trouble because you've got everything all dissociated. You have to go into therapy then and begin to work through all the pain that is there, whatever its original basis was. And that's as it should be. And if you go into this field, most likely you are a trauma survivor. I've said this before, but I've never met a clinical psychologist or a devoted social worker. I'm not so sure about psychiatrists who did not suffer very significant trauma, overwhelmingly traumatic events that were too much and had to be dissociated. It's part of the requirement for the field. Like if you just had a fairly uneventful childhood that just has the normal difficulties and things that make you suffer, and there's always things to make you suffer, but things to make you feel good, you're not going to go into this field, because why would you? You have to be a kind of crazy person to go into this field. I say that at the same time as I also say it's the most wonderful field in the world. There's no other field where you can really learn about people and know them as deeply, as profoundly, learn about the human condition in a certain way. There's nothing quite like it. So I hate this field, but I love this field totally. I hate dissociation because it was my undoing almost. I love it because it saved my life. It saves all people who are trauma survivors. So everything I'm saying might apply to a whole bunch of you. Open your hearts to know the truth of what I'm saying. Swallow the Kool-Aid. If I say it, it must be true. It just must be. Or you can believe Rick Santorum if you want. And why did I say that? Because I'm obnoxious, that's why. I just can't hold back. My wife says, don't say that, kind of thing. Just stick with the material. Don't attack the politicians. All right, Liz, all right, all right. You know what happened that time you said too much and they turned you in. Don't let that happen again, George. Anyway.
Oh my God.
Here's another set of thoughts. I'm building up for my saga. The saga will start on Friday. And I'm kind of deliberately delaying because my daughter and her boyfriend are coming to class on Friday, and I wanted to have a dazzling class to give them. So Friday's going to be dazzling. Today's kind of like all over the place and kind of interesting, disturbing, depressing, some of it. Wait till you hear the horror stories I have to tell you. Here's another question. Is it necessary? Oh, let's see. What? Yeah. I have dissociation, which occurs in, like a sequence of traumas occur. They're all dissociated. Sometimes it results in the formation of a system of alternate personalities, and sometimes it doesn't. Why is it? What has happened in the lives of those who split into independent, alternate identities, as opposed to those who dissociate and turn themselves, maybe repeatedly, into someone these terrible things aren't happening to, but the effect of the dissociation doesn't result in the formation of alternate personalities? No one knows the answer to that. There's nothing cut and dried about it. This would be one of the areas of things that aren't understood, that there needs to be deeper clinical research into. People who work with and treat trauma survivors, lots of them, those who split into multiplicities and those who don't, and thinking through and looking real carefully at each one and comparing and contrasting them, trying to get an insight into what brings about the emergence of alters. So I don't know the answer to that. I just know that in some people it's there with a vengeance. And it's a profound way that the thing is all expressed. And in other people, you have seemingly equivalent levels of savage disaster that have occurred, traumatic in proportion, and the whole thing is just kind of bundled up together and blocked out of awareness, dissociated, but there's not a whole system of little children to which it happened to, that come pop up and pop back and go here and do there and talk in different ways and do all the things that the multiples do. So I don't know the answer to that, but I have a bunch of question marks that are just saying that's clinical research that needs to be pursued. Is it being studied? Hardly at all, not really at all. Why? Because our field is full of assholes. Like if the phenomenological method were adopted as the central strategy, the central perspective, it would be natural that people would do this. What are the nuances of trauma that sometimes eventuate in multiplicity, other times just in massive dissociation with no elaboration of multiplicity? I had an interesting experience with someone that bears on this, and I've kind of summed it up in a question. You won't understand this question until I tell the story that it's based on. But here the question. The question is it necessary in the emergence of multiplicity that someone is found who can be a mother? Okay, that's the question. You've no way you could understand what this is, but it's based on a clinical story that I now want to tell you. This is not my saga, this is another case. I've treated 3 multiples all the way to integration in my life. I've supervised the treatment of about 5 or 6. So I have a fair amount, not vast amount, but a fair amount of experience with this in its different manifestations. This story is about one of those. Oh, I have to work myself back into the memory now. One fine day, as usual, and it would be about 20 years ago, I was sitting in my office in Highland Park with nothing to do, reading the New York Times, drinking a cup of coffee, getting pissed off at the Republicans, because that's about all I do. I just read the politics and get all mad and rip the paper up and then go on about my business. Why do you say that, George? Says Liz. I hear her voice, you know what I mean? And the phone rang. And I answered. And it was a woman. Did I give her a name in my story here? I don't think so. But I just called her, Karen or Sarah or something, whatever, it doesn't matter. What do you need to know about her? She was perhaps 45 years old. Yeah, 45 or 46 years old. Not quite 50, 47. She was herself a counseling psychologist. A degree in counseling psychology from education department, but worked as a counselor, therapist herself. That's another feature of her. And she was married with 2 children, both of whom were in high school, so that's another biographical detail. And she had been in psychoanalytic psychotherapy 3 times a week for 8 years with a colleague of mine whom I know very well, okay, who lives in a major metropolitan area nearby. Maybe Philadelphia, maybe New York City, maybe who knows where it is. I'll just make this up. Anyway, so I said, well, hello, Sarah Smith. What's the story? What do you need? She said, I need a consultation desperately. I said, okay. You want to talk right now? I had an hour free, so we began to talk. And she said that she had been in therapy with my colleague for 8 years and was getting more and more dissatisfied with what was going on. And so I did what I do in cases like this. I just try to get the story, both of what's taking place in the therapy and the outline of the story of the person's life, including childhood. So I can catch on to the themes that are operating, the nature of the traumas, if there are any, and there generally are, because trauma causes emotional disturbance that leads people into therapy in the first place. Current contemporary traumas often occurring that are repeating, magnifying the effects of more distant ones in the past. So all this, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with her. And as I talked to her, she began to say some strange things to me. She said that one of the first things she said was, here's the phenomenological point of view working, doctrine of reality with a small r, realities plural. She said, I was sent to Earth. I'm not actually an Earth citizen. I was sent here from an alien civilization. And I said, really? Tell me about that. She said that she was transported into the womb of her mother to be born and serve a specific purpose, which was to raise the spirits of her very deeply depressed father. She was slated for a lifetime of service to improve the emotional well-being of other people, but in particular of her own father. And no one knew that she was an alien. Okay, so I was in my phenomenological mode already, so I'm quite ready to hear a thing like that. And if she says it's so, then it's so. That's it as far as I'm concerned. True, in my reality, maybe there aren't aliens coming into wombs and stuff like that, but who's to say that I'm right and she's wrong? So I don't absolutize my own, all that kind of stuff. So I'm very receptive, and I just tell me more. I want to hear more about you. And she began to talk about her childhood, and it turned out she was the victim of horrific sexual abuse by her mother, not by her father. I'll sum it up like this, and I'm not going to go into the graphic details of the stories I eventually heard, but her mother used her basically as a masturbation toy, like from a very young age, like 1.5 years old. She would take her and just mash her face into her genital organs and use her to give herself orgasms, and that was just the beginning of the sexual abuse from the mother. It was really, really bad stuff. Okay, and she said, and as she continued to talk about it, I began to see signs that there might, at least at one time, have been a multiplicity there. And sexual abuse, sexual attack, is almost a recipe for generating multiplicity. You guys cannot believe how highly correlated the elaboration of a system of alters is with sexual attack in childhood. It's like 90%. There's 10% it's not that. Turns out that there are other attacks that are not externally sexual abuse, but are also attacks on the child's bodily integrity that can have the same effect as a sexual attack. Anyway, so I began to be suspicious that this woman was a multiple as we began to talk more and more deeply about it. And then finally she mentioned, well, you know, there once were some boys. I knew what she was talking about. There was alters and they were male. Multiple personality, they can be either gender, they can be any age, they can be from infancy to 93-year-old, 91-year-old men. You're going to see in the saga story I have, one of the alters named Abraham was 91 years old, which might be hard to believe how a 19-year-old girl could have a 91-year-old man inside of her, but she did. Anyway, this one had some boys. They were children. And there were 3 of them. And then it turned out there was another girl, too. So there were 5 of them altogether. So I asked her, I said, well, Karen, what were the names of those boys? She says, oh, that was a long time ago. I really don't remember anything about that. That was then, this is now. I have no idea what their names were. That was really, I've forgotten all about that. I said, really? And then this is when I was affected by this. And this is one of these moments where I let what is said to me flow over my mind like a waterfall, and I wait to see what idea comes to me. And then if it comes and it sounds good, I'll say it. And sometimes it has really great effects. Sometimes it blows up in my face like a bomb. So don't think that I'm a miracle worker who has ESP and can just know what to say. I'm not telling you all the stories where the person tried to attack me because I said some stupid-ass thing came into my mind. So it's just like that. But still in all, I've learned to trust my intuition as at least at times providing a kind of insight or inspiration that is useful in the dialogue, because you want it to go forward. So it came to me like she said, well, I don't really remember that. It's a long time ago. I don't really have any idea what it is. I said, well, let me tell you what I was thinking. She said, what's that? I said, it's not a very nice thing to forget a person's name. That's what I said. It's not a very nice thing to forget a person's name. Kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Like your mama should tell you, no, don't forget people's names. Remember them. They need to be remembered. That's what came out of me. She was silent for a good 20 seconds. And then she answered in the following way. She said, I can see that you're a mother. This is the whole problem in my analysis. My analyst is only a father. He wants me to be grown up and reasonable all the time. That's the whole problem we have. So this inspiration to say this to her opened up the whole problem in the analysis. Her analyst was always encouraging her, bidding her to kind of rise to an adult level and think things through rationally and logically. But there were children inside of her, and child feelings and child traumas and child emotional experiences that couldn't rise up like that. So I said, well, what really happened then with this analyst who wants you to be grown up and reasonable? She said, well, and then her voice got real low and real quiet. She said, the boys think he hates children because he wants everybody to be grown up. I said, what did they do when they saw that he hated children? He said, they hid themselves because they were afraid he would kill them. I said, where did they hide? She said, in my stomach. And it turned out that for the past 6 or 7 years, she had suffered from terrible gastrointestinal problems that were psychogenic in origin. There was nothing wrong with her physiological system. But she had tremendous bouts of nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, would come and go and come and go and come and go, as if there was some kind of something going on in her stomach. So apparently the alters had in flight from the analyst who hated children, who bid her to always become grown up and reasonable, had located themselves there, and no longer existed as alters. They existed as a psychosomatic set of symptoms. It's kind of amazing. This is really cool. I don't know if you know how cool this is, to be able to have a clinical experience like this, where you can see how the issues and traumas express themselves first in this way and then in that way, depending upon the kind of environment they encounter. Turned out I knew this analyst very well. And I can't say that he was a close friend, but he's someone I knew about. What did I do with, so anyway, there's so much in the story, I want to reduce it down to the simplest terms. So I ended our conversation with a clear idea that she was an incompletely healed alter. She'd had many, many years of therapy, but the selves had not reunified. That's what you're looking for, is the reunification of the selves. The trauma to be finally processed completely. They come together, glom into one person. She was not one. She was acting like one because he wanted her to be grown up and reasonable. But the parts of her that were not able to do so fled into her stomach, and she had these terrible symptoms. And the analysis as a whole was going down the toilet. Okay? So he knew she was coming to me and had encouraged her to do it, because I sort of have a reputation for dealing with trauma cases and blah-da-dee-da. So I called him up and I said, Jim, or John, whatever it is, that's not his name, I'm not giving you names. Here's the story. I talked to your friend Karen, and I think she's an incompletely healed alter. I thought I was the only one that worked with cases like this. He says, no, George, you're not the only one. So do some of the others of us too. And I said, well, good for you. But you're in trouble with her. He said, why is that? He said, because she's not really healed. And there still are some boys there. And they're taking the form of the gastrointestinal symptoms. But the problem is, they think you hate children. He said, what? They think you hate children. Okay? So you need to talk to her about that and work that out and do something around that. Or if you don't, the thing is going to come to grief probably. I was real nice about it and tried to be real respectful and all that. He said, well, I certainly will talk to her about that. And I thank you for that. So he got together with her a couple of days later, and he said that we had the call, and he said, this is quote, she quoted to me what he said then to her, so I'll quote through her what he said. He said, Karen, I really need to talk to you about something you have completely misunderstood. Where did you get the totally wrong idea that I hate children? I love children. You see what was happening there? He just denied that it was true. Then he wanted to know where she got that idea. It was a completely unreasonable idea. So he did the same thing again. He zapped her again with this idea of reason. Be reasonable, girl. I don't hate children. I love my daughter. I've gone about my life in this wonderful way, respecting children. What's caused you to have such an unreasonable idea? So he was like stabbing her in the same wound that he'd already been doing it by insisting, by being a father. Father, 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 father. Their relationship ended at this point. And she begged me to take her on as a patient, which I agreed to do. Reluctantly, because I don't like taking patients that have belonged to former colleagues, because what happens is it destroys my relationship with the colleague. Sure enough, he thought I stole his patient. This idea that you're stealing patients, did I mention this before? A patient is not a possession. It is impossible to steal a person. I mean, if a person is a slave, you could steal somebody's slave, I guess. That would be if a person was a possession. But if somebody takes my patient and takes him or her into therapy, and it's happened a number of times, I say more power to you. My God, if you find something better, go for it. Maybe I'm a little upset because I've failed, perhaps, to reach this person. But I'm not going to say you're stealing my patient. I feel anybody who says their patient has been stolen under such conditions should be locked up and whipped. I wouldn't kill them for it, but I would whip them for about 6 months of whippings I'm full of all this anger to hear my wife again. Don't talk that way. Somebody in your class is in there recording it. Of course, we're recording the whole thing. We're going to go play it to the dean. You're recommending whipping people. That's what my wife warns me about. So shut up, George, shut up. So speaking of multiplicity, I've got all these personalities inside me. Yet some of them yelling at me. Anyway, but do you see what happened? And so I had to bear with that. And I told him, no, I'm just doing what I can for her, is all it is. By the way, she was right. This is a gentleman who hates children. But the child he hates most of all, and I know him so well that I'm quite certain I'm right, is the child he carries within himself. The details don't matter, but he was subject to horrendous trauma himself as a child. And he has dealt with that through an enduring dissociation and denial, and kind of identified with being very mature, very sophisticated, very European, very careful and very well put together, and everything is immaculate in his office, and his dress is always perfect and all this. And he's not on friendly terms with the child inside of him. And he's in a relationship to that child of more or less complete, I guess the word would be disavowal. He knows about his trauma, he's not with amnesia, but he's cut off from the emotion of his own childhood vulnerability. I have a theory, and it's a theory based on what I've seen over decades of clinical practice. The only therapists who can work with multiples, people severely traumatized who generate the alters, are therapists who can be mothers, who can be protective, who can be loving, and who are on friendly terms with their own traumatized selves, if you know what I mean, who are open to their own trauma and able then to be open to somebody else's trauma. If a therapist is walled off significantly from massive injuries that he or she has suffered, there is no way for that therapist to be able to help someone also walled off, or who's dealing with it through psychosomatic symptoms or through the elaboration of a multiplicity. So what happened is, guess what? The boys came out of her stomach when I began to work with her, and I met them all, and I talked to them independently, autonomously, and separately. Each one had a separate name. The names were remembered now because she had a mother. I was that mother. I'm very aware that my own history and my own identification with my mother is actually involved kind of organically, and it's making something like this is possible. But I ended up wondering whether maybe one of the things about multiplicity is that you have a person with a vast trauma history, and how is it going to manifest itself? Well, sometimes it can manifest itself in a flowering of seemingly autonomous alters. But what are the conditions that would allow that to happen? Maybe you need someone there to be a mother who can recognize those children and make room for them and talk to them as separate people. And if you have only a father, you're surrounded by fathers, you be reasonable, grow up, young woman, young man, whatever it is, maybe you can't really elaborate alters. They'll transform themselves into strange symptoms like upset stomach all the time, or some other set of symptoms that could be. So these are just questions I have. I kind of think that multiplicity is a phenomenon that belongs to an this is intersubjectivity theory, which is the theory that Bob Speller and I have worked on for the last 40 years together. But everything is embedded in a relational field. And so whatever your experience is, including the experience of a multiplicity, sort of depends on a certain context that you're in, and a certain way of relating to other people, and they're relating to you. And if there's vast trauma, and there's a current intersubjective field where someone can be a mother, then maybe that increases the chances of a flowering of seemingly autonomous alters. If there's only a father there, maybe there's going to be psychosomatic symptoms. This again is it's just interesting possibilities and conjectures that need to be followed up with careful clinical research studies, each of which would take years, because you have to work with people for years to get to know them well enough to get inside their world, to get inside their phenomenological experiences. Okay? Now you might wonder what happened to this woman and what happened to the George and Karen show after that. Well, I began to see her very frequently. I met all the boys. There were 3 boys and 1 girl. They were all 5 or 6 or 7 years old. She herself was 47 or 48 now. I worked with her for about 15 to 20 years. I don't remember how many years it was. More than 15, less than 20. And she and I never talked, this is really strange, but we never talked about the multiplicity itself. Sometimes the boys were there, or the girl that was there too would just be there and talk to me. But I just was receptive and didn't do much of anything, but just receptively talk to each one. What are you experiencing? What are you feeling? And oh yeah, and tell me all about it. A lot of it was memories of sexual abuse by her mother. There were some memories of sexual attack by her father. I was never sure if they were true. You hear stories in this field that you don't know whether they're right or not. Sometimes people create physical, horrible images of what's happened to them, recall them as if they were really historical truth. They tell a therapist who doesn't know whether to believe them or not. I just live with the uncertainty when I'm not sure. I was quite sure she was telling the truth, historical truth about her mother. Everything fit together with that. It did not fit that the father would sexually attack her, but she remembered a few times he did. So I had an open mind about that. But I didn't say yes or no to that. I just listened to the story. Anyway, years went by where we were talking, getting along very, very well. She stopped talking about being an alien from space. That just kind of receded and vanished. I didn't worry about that anymore. I didn't say it was true or not true. I'm not going to do that. It just went away. She did well in her work. Her own counselor, she was a wonderful therapist, too. You might find it hard to believe that a multiple could be a wonderful therapist. Well, you just don't understand anything if you're thinking that, because sometimes multiples have parts of themselves that can be just stellar in their achievements. I knew one that was a cardiac, what do you call it, a neonatal cardiac surgeon with an MD, operating on infants' defective hearts, and then going out for sex games at night after the surgery, or another alter would do that. So, anything is possible. It's the most amazing field. You see things you scarcely would think could ever occur. Anyway, I'm just making a long story short. I've drawn a picture on the board. About maybe 9 or 10 years into my work with her, the boys had come out of her stomach. Her gastrointestinal symptoms had cleared up. The whole story that had never been completely told seemed to have been told about the sexual attacks and the abuse, the confusion of her early childhood, and the horrible things she'd been put through by her crazy-ass mother, enacting her trauma in some way, the mother, whatever the story was there. Anyway, suddenly she told me, she had a country home she went to, this woman, in Pennsylvania, I'll say. And she began to go there more frequently, she and her husband. And she took up the hobby of gardening, which she had never done before, and began building a beautiful garden out in front of her house. And then I found out that she had arranged it into a pentagon. I've drawn it on the board there, the garden. And she had bought 5 different kinds and colors of flowers and planted them in the garden, but they were flowers that would bloom all at the same time. So one day she just told me how she had done this and how the garden was blooming. And it was like red, green, yellow, purple, whatever the colors were, arranged in a perfect pentagon with a little stone wall around the whole thing. And you could just see that it was a symbol of the integration taking place. I didn't say that. I wouldn't want to disturb it by saying, wow, what a cool integration symbol. I guess your personalities have come together. They might fall apart if you said that. So I just said, wow. That is just gorgeous and beautiful. And there was a kind of unspoken understanding. She knew I knew what this was. I knew what it was. I knew she knew I knew, but we didn't say anything about it. Sometimes silence is a fine and golden thing. I've learned that the hard way by blabbing with my blabbermouth to many people and having it destroying all the progress that has been produced over years or something like that. So I'm much better now. Just shut the hell up. I started to say, shut the fuck up. Hear my wife. Don't use that F word. They're taping you. Yes, they are. Yes, I am. We are. Anyway, isn't it funny? So it's a really good story there. This eventuated in an integration, and she's been okay. And by the way, we'll go over this. Multiples have a fantastic prognosis if they're given the right therapy to come together as a whole. Now, see, I've used up almost my whole time now. I need another 15 minutes. I want to give you some stories that will blow your mind, and I haven't done it yet. Is there anything else up here? Here's my famous chart. Write all this down, please. DX is a fancy medical model abbreviation for diagnosis, okay? We all like the DX. Two DXs here contrasted. Dissociative identity disorder, aka multiple personality disorder, so-called schizophrenia. I always put so-called because I object to the term and the concept, but I don't object to the study of people in the disasters that are called this. What's the first presenting symptom you see in a true multiple? Like if you have a patient come to you, and let's imagine they haven't had any therapy before either. This woman that I just talked about had had many, many years of therapy, even before the therapist that she was dissatisfied with. So she was way down the road already, but incompletely healed. But what's the first sign you see? And you should memorize this too, because you might need it in your own clinical practice and should think about it if you see it. If a person comes and says, by the way, doctor, or Miss Smith, or whatever your name is, whatever it is, I am a multiple personality. I have actually a whole bunch of different selves that don't get together too well. That's almost a surefire sign the person is schizophrenic if you're going to use the diagnosis, as opposed to multiple. It's an interesting thing about this. The first sign is never, I am a multiple, because the statement, I am a multiple, sort of expresses that there's an I that knows that there's a multiplicity. So there's at least some presence of a kind of embracing, inclusive, first-person singular I, identity there. But multiples are all divided up, and the alters come and alternate with each other. And so the first symptom is never that. And if you see that being said, one of two possibilities are, it's a multiple who's had 25 years of therapy maybe already, and knows that's what she is, and is way down the road. And this woman was to some extent that way. But more likely, it's a person in a fragmentation state. A person who feels he or she does not have a cohesive self and feels all divided up into different entities. The entities into which one is divided are all present simultaneously, but the feeling is of being in pieces, in fragments. That's a schizophrenia, fragmentation, annihilation state. So if a person claims to be a multiple, either they're the genuine article way down the road in partial integration, because they eventually will say that and see that and know that, or they're more likely to be schizophrenic. And I had a psychiatrist colleague who would say it was a definitive diagnostic sign of schizophrenia if the person claimed to be a multiple. And I just always thought that was so interesting. But what is the sign that you see? It's losing time. The person has bouts of amnesia. They're going about their business, and suddenly a day has gone by, or a week has gone by, or even half an hour has gone by they have no memory for at all. Something else has happened. So the experience of time is kind of divided up into intervals for which there's continuous memory, bounded by other intervals in which there's complete absence of any memory at all. And so your patient might come to you and say, I don't know what happened to me, but I don't have any recall of the last 2 days. I know I must have been doing something, but what it was, I don't know. Now, there are other reasons why a person might develop amnesia like this, but at least one very common one is a dissociative episode. And in some dissociative episodes, or people who are prone to them, it's a matter of another alter has been present in the ascendant for the last 2 days and going about its business. And then when you come back, the one that is present at the time, there's just no recall of anything that just took place. So watch out for losing time, for episodes of amnesia. Think multiple. It's not for sure, because there can be other reasons why. You'll see when I get to my patient, Jean, next time, she showed this in abundance. But this was early 70s, before anybody knew how common multiplicity was. I had no suspicion she was a multiple, and I was afraid she had some kind of brain problem. I was trying to get her to go to a neurologist. She wouldn't do it. She knew better than to believe it was a brain problem. But you'll hear about that. Okay, what are the presenting symptoms of a so-called schizophrenic? It's delusions and hallucinations, the 4 A's of schizophrenia. We've gone over that. Inappropriate affect, loss of oneself in an autistic world of your own imagining, thought disorder, your associative process is all going off in all kind of directions and tangents. Inappropriate affect, did I say that? And the ambivalence, all